Good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 18th of November 2025. Soon be Christmas. Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on this evening. Thank you for spending some time with us. And we're going to have a really interesting conversation this evening. It's going to be quite a spicy show. We're going to be throwing a few rocks around at economists and cash for comment and what the Treasury is up to and a few other things too. And very much talking about housing and whether housing is actually due for a correction, what might bring that on. And then more broadly, what are some of the migration issues that are bubbling away below the surface and a few other things too. So it should be great. Just before I bring him in, let me remind you, we don't provide specific financial or legal advice, general conversation only. We moderate the chat, but feel free to throw questions and comments in as we go. And if you'd like to get my attention to ask a question, if you use that Walk the World, that'll get it into my queue. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means that you can get your question to the top of the list or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Really appreciate those who support us via Super Chat or indeed via PayPal or Patreon. They really help to cover the cost of what we do here, which we don't do for profit. We do because we think there's a really important conversation about, probably more than ever before. This is an important conversation. Right, let me bring Leith straight in. Leith, welcome back. Lovely to see you again.
Yeah, g'day, Martin. How's things?
Very good. Just had our first frost overnight, so it's a bit cooler here today. The dogs are sitting in their basket rather than actually on the floor now. But yeah, it's been really busy. I've had so many requests from all sorts of sources relating to housing finance, pressure on households, all of those things. I feel as though things are bubbling up, and I think we're going to see some rather concerning trends emerging ahead. Not sure on timing, but it doesn't look too good to me. So yeah, that's my take. I guess you're pretty busy there at the moment too.
Yeah, certainly. Always towards the end of the year, you start feeling a little bit tired, and looking forward to the sort of Christmas break. So at Macrobusiness, we pretty much work year round, but we do have the time off between Christmas and New Year's, and a little bit of time off in January. So that's always good to recharge the batteries. So it's all pretty good. I was away last week working on a working holiday, so did a little bit less media, which meant a few more hours in the day. But yeah, it's all been pretty good. Very busy, lots to talk about, which I'm sure we're going to hammer into some of it tonight. The housing market's always interesting. The immigration debate, so many topics.
Absolutely, and I called this, the sort of the shadow boxing. Right, the economic shadow boxing, and I think it's time to stop the economic shadow boxing. What I mean by that is that if you look back, we had a whole bunch of bank economists saying our rates are coming way down, and we had people forecasting all sorts of very positive moves and saying no, migration isn't a problem, and the more I sort of thought about this, and actually the Grattan Institute report on change your planning rules and that will solve everything. Is a classic example. It seems to me that we have a real problem in Australia with regards to economists changing their story every time the wind blows. Then we have Michelle Bullock, of course, saying, "Oh, it's all about household wealth. Household wealth's going up, spending's fine, nothing to see here. Oh, inflation's a bit hot. Maybe we can't cut interest rates." And it all sums up quite nicely to me in this slide. This is the Catality slide, right? $12 trillion in residential real estate, 12 trillion, compared with 4.3 trillion in superannuation, 3.6 trillion in listed stocks, 1.3 trillion in commercial real estate. But this is a killer. 55.5% of household wealth is held in housing. And I think to myself, what? That cannot be good.
No, that's very interesting, because that data comes from Cotality's, I think, their latest November chart pack, I think it is.
Yes,
it is. It's interesting. So in the back of that chart pack, there's actually a slide or a chart that shows that the total value of Australia's dwelling stock. So that's basically every single home in the country. You just think about every single, 11.3 million homes, I think it is, in the country. They're now worth $12 trillion. And, that's over 4 times GDP. And the scary thing about that, Martin, is that 9 years ago, it was worth $6 trillion. So in just 9 years, the value of Australia's housing stock has doubled, which is just insane when you think about it. And, what the other scary factor about that, I wrote an article on it last week, is that if you divide that 12 trillion by the number of dwellings in Australia, it means that the average home in Australia, so we're not just talking about Sydney homes here, we're talking about, the middle of, I don't know, the back arts, well, I shouldn't say that, so the back of Buggery, wherever the hell it is, back of Burke, I should say, a little shack out there, or a little bed sit apartments, a whole lot. If you average out every single dwelling in the country, they're now worth, on average, $1,050,000. Right? That is just an extraordinary volume of money. And it's the principal reason why Australia is now considered, Australian households are now supposedly the second most wealthiest households in the world, according to the UBS Global Wealth Report. Now, we rank the second highest. Well, the reason for that is because we've got expensive homes, right? So, as you said, it's about 55% of our wealth is tied up in housing. Well, according to the UBS Global Wealth Report, we stand out from other countries in how much of our wealth is stored in illiquid homes, whereas other countries on that list actually have their wealth predominantly in financial assets, which you can eat. Like, you can sell that and you can buy food and whatever. But ours is stored primarily in the homes that we live in. So what good is it to you? Like, my home is supposedly worth $2.5 million roughly, right? I'm not boasting. I'm just saying it's ridiculous. I bought that, I don't know, 12 years ago or something in Melbourne. And what difference does it make if it's worth 5 or it's worth 1? Like, I'm still living here, right? So it makes no difference. And my mum's house, for example, she bought in 1972 for $17,500 in Melbourne. Well, it's probably, I don't know, God, it'd be worth, heaps now. But would it have mattered if that house rose by half as much versus what it is now? Like, she's no better or worse off. She's just living in the house, right? It doesn't matter what it's worth. It's all paper wealth. It doesn't do anything. And, unless you're a property investor, it does zero for you. And because everyone needs a home to live in. So, if she sells her house and buys another one, or I sell my house and buy another one, well, you buy and sell them to the same market. So you can't take it with you. You just end up paying more for the next house because yours has gone up. So the next house has gone up as well. You just pay more in stamp duty and all that sort of stuff. So it's absolutely useless wealth when you think about it. And here's the other thing, Martin. So, we're the second wealthiest households in the world. Yeah, okay, that's great. No, it's not. But if you actually went back to 1991, so I did this analysis a while back. So in the 1991 census, the home ownership rate in Australia was actually 5% higher than it is now, right? But homes were only worth 3 times incomes back in 1991. They're now 8 times incomes now. So notionally, we're wealthier now because our homes are worth 8 times income and we're sitting on this massive asset. But I'd argue that we're actually better off in 1991 because the home ownership rate was, 5% higher than it is now. We had way less mortgage debt as a proportion of income. So we're less indebted. And the banking system back in 1991 lent 2/3 to businesses and only 25% to mortgages, and the rest was for personal lending. Nowadays, it lends almost 2/3 to mortgages, and businesses, get about 30% of lending. So the economy was arguably a lot more structurally sound back in 1991 as well, because we actually had a more diversified economy. We had a manufacturing industry. We had far cheaper housing. We had a banking system that actually lent productively to businesses. We had a higher home ownership rate. But if you use these global wealth rankings, we're actually a lot poorer back then because our homes are only worth 3 times income versus 8 times now. But, this is why these wealth statistics are complete rubbish. Right? We shouldn't even count really housing wealth as wealth because it's really a cost, right? It's just a cost. And is paying a higher lifetime share of your income to put a roof over your head, whether that's to rent or buy or to pay off a mortgage, is that better off than? Are you better off than paying a lower share of your lifetime's earnings to put a roof over your head, as you would have in 1991? I think you're actually better off. So I think actually, when in the true word of wealth, in terms of quality of life and how much lifetime's earnings you have to spend on housing, and how much more disposable income you have, and how much more balanced the economy was, etc. We're actually a lot better when in 1991 when our homes were 3 times income, not 8 times now. So. It's all a bit of a farce, this whole, household wealth thing. If your house goes up, you're rich. It doesn't do anything for you. And in my case, I've got a 17-year-old son and a 15-year-old daughter. And I'm like, well, I'm actually pretty happy that Melbourne house prices haven't gone up in 7 years. So my home's worth about, exactly the same as what it was 7 or 8 years ago. But that's actually a good thing. Like I don't go, oh, gee, this sucks. My house hasn't gone up like it has in Brisbane and all these other places, because A, it doesn't do anything for you because I live in Melbourne. B, it'll just screw over my kids, because, had it gone up another $1 million, well, then my kids were never going to be able to buy a house or afford to, purchase a house. The dream of home ownership is dead. And then, of course, it also means that I'll have to help them into the market anyway through the bank of mum and dad, because, even though Melbourne's done nothing for years, it's still too expensive for them. So if your house price goes up and you've got children, you just end up having to spend more to help them into the market. So you're worse off there as well. So, Australia's just got to get off this high horse about house prices. Pretty much every conversation you have now, whether you go to parties and that, it always gets back to house prices. In fact, actually, I shouldn't say every conversation. I actually went to my 30-year school reunion last Friday. That's how old I am now. And not one person mentioned housing, which was unbelievable. So that was actually quite refreshing. But, that's the exception, not the norm. Most times you go somewhere, everyone's talking about the housing market. It's tedious. It's been tedious for 12 years. This house price bubble that Australia has, and I call it a bubble because Jared Minack did a fantastic chart. And he showed, I've actually got it on the slide, and he showed that that Australia's land value. So land values in Australia, residential land values, make up 75% of total dwelling values. So it's the land price that drives up the price of housing. It's not the structures, it's not the buildings, the bricks and whatever that go on it. And Jared Minack actually showed that Australia's land value to GDP, which is the bottom chart on the right here, currently is the same as what Japan's was in the late 1980s during the great Japanese land bubble, just before it all busted and they had a 30-year recession basically. So if Japan's housing market was a bubble back in the late 90s with a land value that was about 3.3 times the size of their economy, well, isn't Australia's residential land market also a bubble? Because ours is also worth about the same share of our economy. It's I don't know when this thing's going to burst. Hopefully it won't be too aggressively. Hopefully it'll be like the sort of Melbourne correction that we've had in the last sort of 7 years, whereby it's just gradually, fallen in real terms and incomes have caught up and that sort of thing. But it could also be violent. So, I don't want it to be a violent crash, because then that'll have a lot of fallout for a lot of people and the economy, et cetera. It'd be better if it just, we have sort of like a New Zealand style or a Canadian style, deflation would be a lot better. But who knows? Like, we're the more this madness happens and the more prices keep going up and the more detached from fundamentals the market becomes, the bigger the risk of it all ending in tears. And who knows when it's going to happen, but, it's frothy.
Yeah, and two quick following observations. The first is, if you look at the growth in money supply, M3 or M2 or whatever, is really, really high and rising very fast again. And of course, money supply is effectively all the money flowing around the system, right? Now, a lot of that money is actually direct resulting from the lending, which has been very strong, and lending for housing has been massive, as you said, for the banks. So the consequences of this is that there is actually an inflationary pulse in the economy because of the growth in housing. That's obviously through the rental lever and also the cost of new builds directly. But the money supply number is inflation in its own right. So we've actually got a loop where banks are lending ever more, chasing housing prices higher, creating more liquidity in the system to be able to actually lend more to chase house prices higher. Now, that's not a virtuous cycle. That's an inflationary cycle, and it's a worrying cycle. Two reasons, as you say. One, well, they lend less to businesses than previously, and in my small business surveys, more and more small businesses are falling because they can't get credit to be able to run their businesses unless they put the house on the line. And then the other point is that the small number of very large lenders who absolutely dominate now the financial landscape in Australia are at the point now they're almost too big to fail. So, of course, as soon as anybody talks about, oh, house prices might need to, ease or come down, then, of course, the next statement, and there's a financial stability risk. So you see that from APRA and you see that from the RBA. Though, interestingly, both APRA and RBA recently warned about the slightly frothiness, particularly in investor lending. So the question I've got, and comes back to this issue that I sort of table at the top of the show, is, is this shadow boxing insofar that are those players, RBA, APRA, and I guess the government too, still committed to ever higher house prices? Because they seem to be. And of course, the Labour government actually said, O'Neill said, house prices are going to go up. So there's a fundamental problem which is distorting and warping the economy and making people's lives more difficult. In my surveys, a greater proportion of people are having to put a higher proportion of their income to service their mortgage. And if you're in the rental sector, then, it's horrendous. More than 3/4 of those in the rental sector on my surveys are in rental stress. They've got a cash flow pressure. So it's not doing well. And that means that people have less to spend. Less economic activity is therefore a result. So it seems to me this black hole that's expanding and expanding and expanding and sucking more and more of the economy into it, it is making the economy narrower based. It's making it more unstable. And yet, if you read the mainstream and, the bank's economists, et cetera, they'll say, it's fine, house prices are going to go up and that's wonderful. There's another story that needs to be told.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that you mentioned APRA and the RBA. So, for about for the last decade, really, APRA and both the RBA and APRA have been warning against high LVR lending, right? So they put out lots of, statements and warnings, et cetera, over the last decade, warning that high LVR lending. So like you were talking about, 5% deposit, 95% loan to value ratio lending is very risky, et cetera. They've warned against it. And then what's the Labor government done? It's brought in it's literally brought in a state-sponsored 5% high LVR lending scheme with its 5% deposit scheme for first home buyers. Right. So, you got the regulators saying, no, that's not a good thing. That's not a good thing. Warning about it for a decade. And then the federal government comes in and goes, you know what? We're going to institutionalize this now, which isn't particularly bright when you think about it. So, we all know why the government did it. It's basically an affordability measure. It's a price stimulus measure dressed up as an affordability measure, right? So they basically want to suck more home buyers in the market, and they're offering them the ability to buy with a 5% deposit without needing lender's mortgage insurance. The taxpayer picks up 15%. They guarantee 15% of the mortgage, and they're basically pulling forward a whole bunch of demand. All these people who wouldn't have been able to buy otherwise, or would have had to wait longer to save a deposit, or people who could have bought but then decide to spend more because they can, right? They can spend up to these very generous price caps. All of a sudden, if you only need a 5% deposit, you can spend more than you would have otherwise. You can borrow more. All this is just putting more fuel on the housing bonfire, and it's in direct contravention of what the RBA and APRA have been warning about for a decade. Like, they literally have come out multiple times against high LVR lending, 5% deposit lending, because they said it's risky. You have, home buyers don't have much equity to protect them. If they fall down, they can go into negative equity, that sort of thing. All that sort of thing. And the federal government's just gone, you know what, we're going to ignore all that. We're going to ignore those warnings, and here we go, off to the races. And talking about cash for comment economists, one of the biggest cash for comment economists nowadays is the Australian Treasury. So, I worked at the Australian Treasury 20 years ago. I left there in January 2006. So, 20 years ago, I was still there, and I was just, leading my last couple of months. But back then, when we started, we were told that we could give, quote, frank and fearless advice. So the Treasury Secretary, Ken Henry, said, basically, he told us, if you disagree with the policy, whatever, you can you're free to disagree with it. And you can write a brief and disagree with it. You'll probably get ignored, but you can disagree with it. Nowadays, Treasury's just turned into a propaganda outfit, basically to spin government policy. And there was no more clear indication of that than this 5% deposit scheme. Like, they put out some absolute garbage modelling that said that after 5 years under Labor's 5% deposit scheme, home prices would only rise by 0.6% of 1%, 0.6% over 5 years. Now, this is just laughable. I reckon it would have done that in probably 2 months, right? That'd be the upward pressure, and after that, it's just going to exceed it. And look, it was hilarious watching Andrew Bragg, the Liberal senator. Not a fan of the guy, but he did grill one of the Treasury officials in Senate estimates about that modelling. And watching this guy talk, he was like a bumbling fool. Like, it's just blah, blah, blah. Yeah, he couldn't give any straight answers, whatever. It's just complete garbage. They just made it up basically to make the government look good. Albo, of course, was out there going, look, it's not inflationary. Treasury says it's not. This is their modelling. This is their, robust modelling, whatever. Yet, Lateral Economics did their own modelling, said it's going to push up prices by, at least 6% additional across the market. And for, at the more affordable end, like the sort of end that for the prices under the price caps, it's probably going to be more like 10% impact. The Reserve Bank in their latest statement of monetary policy said explicitly that it's going to put upward pressure on house prices. Like, nobody believes the Treasury. It's just complete garbage modelling. And yet, they put this garbage out. Albo and Jimbo Chalmers and Claire O'Neill go, look, see, it's not going to, it's helping first home buyers. It's not going to be self-defeating, blah, blah, blah. It's just garbage policy. And unfortunately, this is the sort of garbage policy we get in Australia. We've got a rental crisis, so the federal government puts the accelerator on immigration. They keep trying to claim it's a supply issue when it's not. It's a demand issue. We have outfits like the Grattan Institute and other YIMBY organisations trying to claim that if we just magically allow, 3-story townhouses to be built everywhere, that we're going to magically get all these homes built, and we're going to bring down rents and bring down prices and usher all this, massive construction, etc. Of course, they ignore the fact that the construction industry in Australia is already operating at capacity. We have a massive pipeline of homes that have been approved but haven't yet been built because we don't have enough workers, we don't have enough resources, etc. They can't afford to build them because the cost of building them is less than what they'll get from customers. But they think that if you just magically allow all this building everywhere, that you're going to magically get all this extra supply, but they can't, because we've got, excessive lot prices. Like the price of land's gone up by about a third since the pandemic. We're talking about residential lots. Construction costs have gone up about 40% since the pandemic. And we have labour shortages in building because our stupid immigration system brings in a whole bunch of people and almost none of them work in construction. So they add to demand without increasing supply, as well as we've got home builders competing against big build infrastructure projects. This, net zero energy transition, which requires a whole bunch of transmission lines and other stuff to be built, which requires tradies. So we just don't have the construction capability to build the homes that we need for this massive population growth that the government keeps foisting upon us. And I wonder why we've got a rental crisis, right? It's just that the policy making in Australia is back to front, and it doesn't have to be this way. You can just look at places like Canada and New Zealand, who've running significantly lower migration programs. Now, New Zealand's hasn't really been by design. It's just happened because they've got a crap economy and migration's collapsed. But Canada's actually explicitly tried to freeze immigration. And as a result of much lower immigration, like an immigration crash in both countries, rents are now falling in both countries. Whereas contrast that with Australia, where rents are now accelerating again. We've got record low rental vacancy rates. And the rental market's tightening yet again and that follows a 40+% rise in rents over the last 5 years on the back of this high immigration. So, we do pretty much everything wrong in this country, and everything is performative. It's all window dressing. It's pretending to help, but actually making the situation worse. And that's unfortunately the Australian modus operandi.
Seems pretty consistent, doesn't it? And there are consequences of those policies. And I made a show the other day about the investor loans going boom. We had some of the biggest lending ever, and that's a big concern, I think, for people trying to compete with investors. So just at the time, the first-time buyer scheme was sort of incremented to make it even more attractive. It's precisely the same time that investors are buying in the same type of property. So you're actually getting a double bubble, right? And then the other factor there as well, which again, I made another show on about the forget the rate cuts, because the unemployment has declined. And of course, Michelle Bullock has said that it's unlikely now that we're going to see rate cuts anytime soon. And again, I want to go back to the fact that the private sector bank economists were forecasting considerable rate cuts. And the markets, of course, were also forecasting considerable rate cuts. And those market forecasts were then fed back by the RBA into their modeling, which means that it's a completely weird cycle where the RBA sort of, is making estimates of where the economy is going to go based on what the markets are saying from the pricing of the rates, despite the fact that it's clear it's not going to happen. So the whole thing is just, again, another mess, really.
Yeah, it's funny. It's interesting you say that. So the Statement of Monetary Policy's economic forecasts, which go to the end of, I think, 2027, they're all predicated on there being one more rate cut, right? So, for example, the RBA forecast that the unemployment rate is going to, so it's currently 4.3%. It was 4.5% last month, in September, fell to 4.3% in October, which is the most recent. The RBA forecast is going to be 4.4% until the end of 2027, right? But that's based on predicated on being one more rate cut, which they got in their models. But now they're saying, but now markets and everyone don't think there's going to be another rate cut. So it's kind of, well, hang on, doesn't that change the forecast? It's sort of weird. The whole thing's weird. Yes. But look, I honestly still think there's a good chance of another rate cut. I mean, definitely not till at least second quarter next year, maybe third quarter, I don't know. But the trigger will be the unemployment rate. So, as I said, the RBA forecast that the unemployment rate's going to basically stay where it is over the next several years. Well, I think that's pretty optimistic because it looks like immigration is resurging, right? Surging back up. So that we're adding about nearly 40,000 new workers a month because of the high immigration. So the labour supply is growing very, very quickly. And that's reflected in the civilian population now, which is growing quite strongly according to the labour market the labour market report. So the working age population is growing by about 40,000 a month now. It might be 38, close to 40. And so what that means is you've got to produce quite a few jobs just to soak up the extra labour supply. Now, pretty much the lion's share of the nation's jobs growth since the pandemic, and certainly in the last few years, has been the non-market sector. So it's mostly been NDIS related. And the problem with it is the state budget's now suffering from big deficits. The federal budget's obviously, suffering from deficits, and it's been propped up by high commodity prices, but that's all starting to come undone now. And there is real pressure now to rein in the NDIS. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to think that the likelihood that we're going to get this ongoing, very strong growth in the non-market sector jobs. And just for those who are new to this, there's basically two sectors in the economy. There's the market sector, which is, just think of it as the private sector. And then there's the non-market sector, which is basically the public service plus sectors that are basically government funded. So you've got your education and your healthcare and social assistance, and then obviously the public service. And it's that non-market sector that's driven most of the job growth in Australia, despite the fact that they only make up about 32% of total jobs. And it's very unsustainable. It's the primary reason why Australia has a lower unemployment rate than most other nations, because we had this huge NDIS stimulus. And that's basically driven a massive job boom, predominantly in healthcare and social assistance, which has flattered the unemployment rate. But it doesn't, nobody should bank on that continuing. Like, it's going to top out at some point. And when it does top out and jobs stop being added swiftly in those sectors, the private sector is going to need to step up. And I can't see it stepping up to fill the void of the massive job growth we've had in the last few years of the non-market sector at the same time as the labour force is growing by nearly 40,000 a month because there's high immigration. So, higher labour supply with less job growth to match that supply means a rise in unemployment rate. And I think there's a very good chance that the unemployment rate will go, above what the RBA is forecasting, which is 4.4%. And if it does, it's got two mandates. It's got price stability and obviously full employment. Well, if the full employment thing hits the skids, it'll be more likely to cut interest rates. So I think that's the path to lower interest rates. You don't get a worsening of inflation, but the unemployment rate goes up. And that's why I still think there's a pretty decent chance we'll get another interest rate cut. But we'll have to see it in the labour market weakening first, and probably won't happen for 6 months before we even see it. So certainly rate cuts are off the agenda for the time being.
Yeah, and the other issue is, of course, talking about the RBA modelling, is the productivity question too. Right now, of course, there was this big thing in Canberra a few months ago. We have a productivity roundtable, and we're going to come up with all of these wonderful innovations to create a whole new wave of productivity improvement. Did you see anything? I didn't see anything happening. But the point to make is the productivity number is a plug number that they basically plug into their model. So it's not an assumption that they start with. It's sort of plugged in on the way through. And, every time Michelle Bullock talks, she talks about, we're not making much progress on productivity, and that's a problem. To my mind, the productivity nut, which is a hard one to crack, I agree, is also being impacted by this massive government support for the public sector. And a lot of the jobs, the bedpan jobs, as I called it, the bedpan economy some years ago, it's an important part of the economy, but if it becomes effectively the main part of the economy,
the driver,
it's very hard to actually create significant economic momentum off the back of that, So that's the problem we've actually got. So we've got an economy that's been supported by a government who's lent a lot more. By the way, that means, of course, that they have borrowed a lot more, which means that the tax take is as high as it's ever been. And the cost of debt is also very high, which is going to actually crimp the investment potential that the government has for the future. So that's the first part. And then the second part is that if, in fact, the public sector is growing really, really fast and everyone's piling in and getting public sector jobs, it means that the private sector can't compete. And so if you look at the investment story in the private sector and the growth in the private sector, well, that's in many areas going backwards. So we've got this really myopic view of the economy, all driven by really silly government policy.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I've actually got some charts on productivity which show that. Excuse me. So the top left is the labour productivity chart. It's by CBA. It's broken down by market and non-market sector. So you can see the market sector, i.e. the private sector, that they've excluded mining here. It's basically had, really good productivity growth for decades. Like it's, there's been ups and downs, but it's been trending up pretty strongly. The non-market sector, which is where the lion's share of the jobs growth has been in the last 5 years, the productivity there is actually lower than it was 20 years ago. So that there is acting as a massive handbrake on productivity. Also, the middle top chart this is from Justin Farbo at Antipode and Macro. He's plotted Australia's real GDP per hour worked, which is a labour productivity measure against other nations. And it shows that Australia's at the equal worst labour productivity growth since 2018. And that's largely due to that expansion of the non-market sector. Also, the bottom left chart, this sort of gets back to what you were saying about investment. Well, one of the main drivers of higher labour productivity is actually investment in new machinery and equipment. But you can see that chart, this is from Alex Joyner at IFM Investors. You can see the investment in new machinery and equipment as a share of GDP has been terrible. Like it's at recessionary levels. That's the top line there. And that poor investment comes at the same time as the government's growing the labour force like a science experiment through high immigration. So what this means is what you get in the top right chart, capital shallowing. So historically, since the Second World War, the main driver of Australia's productivity growth is that every worker in the economy has had more capital to work with. So that's more machinery and tools and equipment and technology and all that sort of stuff. And when you give workers that, they become more productive. And I've used this example before. And maybe it's not the best example, but it's kind of easy to understand. If you've got a cafe with one coffee machine and 2 workers working on it who can make 100 coffees an hour, if you suddenly double the number of workers working that one machine, you're not going to double the amount of coffees made the next hour, because you're going to get congestion. They have to wait for each other. There's going to be, all that sort of stuff. Well, that's an example of capital shallowing, right? And that's effectively kind of what Australia's experienced in the last, 10 years at least, since we've run this high immigration policy and we've had low investment. It means that the amount of capital per worker has shrunk, or it's at least not grown at the rate that it used to grow at, which means that they become less productive, which is what you're showing on the top right chart. And in fact, the middle center chart, I've used this one before. This is one of my ones where I've plotted per capita GDP, which is really a function of productivity over the long run, against the immigration rate. So immigration is the share of the population growth as an annual rate. And you can see that as immigration's gone up, it's that the immigration line's inverted. So down means up. Just if you're wondering why it looks like that. But basically, as immigration's increased, productivity's decreased, and therefore per capita GDP's decreased. And then on the bottom right chart, this is what I was getting at before when I was talking about lending by banks. Back in the early 90s, as I said, banks used to lend primarily for businesses. Now they lend primarily for mortgages. So that also makes you less productive. So we've got basically the setup here for a less productive economy, because we've got massive growth in these non-market jobs, like these government jobs, which are low productivity. We've got really poor private business investment, especially in new machinery and equipment, which means that workers get less tools and technology and all the other stuff you need to become more productive. At the same time as we're growing the population aggressively through immigration. So we've got less investment, but more workers. So the way capital deepening is measured is it's the capital to labor ratio, right? So capital is the numerator. So think of that as your new machinery, equipment, that sort of technology, that sort of stuff. The denominator is labor, which is the number of workers. So it's a proxy for immigration. Well, the numerator has fallen. So we've had less of the numerator and we've got more in the denominator. So as a result, the capital labor ratio is plummeting. It makes you less productive. So this is basically the Australian disease that we've got now. We've got, government just spending more and more money, employing more and more people in effectively the public service, or, you can be working in the private service, but it's a government funded job. Like if you're like an NDIS provider or something like that, you can be a private NDIS provider, but your funding's from the government essentially. So we've got more of that. We've got more people because the government's growing immigration aggressively still. We'll probably talk about that soon. And then we've got less private business investment to go with it. So this is just a recipe for low productivity growth and low living standards, and also low wages, low real wages, because you can't have growing real wages without productivity growth. Because ultimately, if you don't have productivity growth, the only way that your wages can grow is through a terms of trade boom, which we've been very lucky the last 20 years. We had a terms of trade boom. Basically, all the things we sold to the world got a pay rise. So iron or coal, that sort of stuff, everything went up in price. So we got more money into the economy. But now that's reversing. And the only other way you can get real wage growth without productivity growth is by taking share off businesses. So businesses have to get less profit and give more distribution to workers. Well, the unit labor cost in Australia, which is basically a measure of that, Australia's had the highest, alongside I think the UK has had the highest rise in the unit labor costs, because, we have actually distributed in the last couple of years profits. We've redistributed away from profits into workers. But even with that, our real wages are down by about 6% from the peak. So it could have been even worse. But ultimately, if Australia's going to get per capita GDP growth and real wage growth, it needs higher productivity. And we don't have it. And I can't see a way that we're going to get it, also because we've decided to give ourselves very expensive energy costs. So we're driving up the cost of electricity, driving up the cost of gas through stupid government policy, lack of gas reservation, this renewables fantasy, net zero policies, all this sort of stuff. So we're also going to give ourselves more expensive energy, which is then going to make us less productive as well. So the bottom line, Martin, this is pretty depressing, but I can't actually see a way out for Australia to have a sustainable rise in productivity under the economic settings that we've got. The big Australia settings, huge volumes of mostly unskilled migration, huge volumes of government jobs, although that's going to slow. But very poor private business investment, high energy costs, and a banking system that's just basically pouring more capital into non-productive housing than business lending. Like, where do you get productivity growth out of that sort of economic setup? I can't see it.
No, but they had this whole long working session in Canberra with all of these experts and all of these, champions. And, you mentioned performative politics, right? This was another huge performative politics thing. It's almost like, well, we've spoken about productivity. We've got everybody together in Canberra, so we've solved the productivity problem, and we can just go on with business as normal. There is no sense that I see from government of even wanting to tackle this productivity question, which to me is one of the most critical questions that should be on the agenda all the time, because it is ultimately about the future prosperity of Australia and Australians. The GDP per capita is going in the wrong direction at the moment. So we are not actually becoming, more wealthy in real terms, even if the the housing wealth is growing, right? Because the settings are all wrong. And this is why I talk about this sort of shadow boxing economics, right? And, they're sort of throwing punches, but they're not hitting because they're not targeting the right things.
Yeah, and it's there pretending to do things rather than doing it. So, we saw this after the, I'm going to sound like I'm picking on Labor here, but all governments do it. This is just because it came to mind. After Kevin Rudd was elected, he did some sort of summit, like a round table and something, yes, or like economic round table, whatever. Nothing came out of that. We had the Jobs and Skills Summit after the Albanese government was elected. Well, we didn't get jobs and skills. We didn't get skills. We just got mass immigration. It was just basically a cover to ramp up immigration to levels we've never seen before, right? And then now we've got the productivity roundtable. Well, that's got a whole lot of crap. And one of the things we're going to get out of that is justification to. So Australia's manufacturing industry is absolutely dying, right? We've got the lowest share of manufacturing in the OECD. It's about 5% of GDP. It's been shrinking, for decades, but it's really been hit hard the last few years with high energy costs. All right, we've lost our last major plastics manufacturer, our last architectural glass maker. We're losing, explosive makers. We've got the steel works and aluminium smelters, and that are all on their deathbed. They only survive through government subsidies because energy costs are high. And the Albanese government's idea of productivity is, I'm going to save manufacturing through our future made in Australia policy, which is basically pouring billions of dollars of government subsidies into areas that, like green hydrogen and all these other rubbish things that are never going to do anything and are actually, not real and will never work, or into Australia suddenly making solar panels, like as if we're going to be able to compete with China on that stuff. When really what we should be doing is just delivering the lowest cost energy and the most reliable energy that we can. We've got oodles of coal, we've got oodles of gas, we've got oodles of uranium. We should be an energy superpower. We should use what we've got and deliver super cheap and reliable energy, like use the resources that we've got. And then if we actually did that, we'd have a manufacturing industry, because instead of energy costs being a disadvantage compared to the rest of the world, it'd actually be an advantage, and it'd be a competitive advantage for Australian manufacturing. If our energy costs were right at the bottom of the global league tables, we're paying some of the lowest energy costs in the world, talking about gas and electricity here, that'd be a massive competitive advantage for manufacturing in Australia. We'd have more of it. But instead, we've made that stuff expensive, so then you get less of it. But there's no will to fix this stuff. In fact, the government just wants to make it worse. So, that's another reason why I've got terrible productivity, because the manufacturing industry is one of the areas which actually do get productivity growth from, because it's an area where you can do capital deepening, where you can invest in machinery, equipment, et cetera, and you'll get more output per unit of energy or per resource input. And it's also competes with the rest of the world. So there's that competitive edge. But instead, we're closing down that stuff. And we're just, instead we're growing areas like NDIS jobs and things, which are totally non-productive. So, Australia's economy, I just can't see there's any way out for us to become high productivity, high growth, high per capita growth, I should say, high growing standard of living economy with, growing real wages, that sort of thing. I think we're actually managed decline, unfortunately, through our own making, which is very sad.
Yeah, and just on the energy briefly, I won't go into it in a lot of detail. We've discussed that in previous shows, but just to highlight that, of course, the critical issue with regard to the energy is the price of gas. And in Australia, the marginal price of electricity is driven off the price of gas, but the price of gas is driven off the international price because of the way that those contracts are set up. So we're actually having the very cheap production of gas in Australia then effectively shipped offshore. And we somehow magically seem to be paying down the East Coast in particular, because there's no reservation system, full international prices or worse plus. And that then puts everything up, because the cost of energy, as you say, is an input to almost everything you do, whether you're manufacturing or whatever you're doing. And that then makes the costs of everything else more expensive. So that's an inflationary impact. And it also has a dampening effect on productivity in manufacturing. And of course, because those high energy prices were in the system, Chalmers then put these electricity subsidies in as well to try and offset, because he wanted to win the last election. So, we'll give you some money back, right? But now, of course, that's rolling off now. So that's put inflation back on again. But where did that money come from? That came from taxpayers. So effectively, once again, taxpayers ended up subsidizing the energy system to allow him to win the last election. So however you look at this is a bit of a scandal.
Yeah. And look, it goes well beyond that. The amount of subsidies that goes into the energy market is absolutely insane. So, we've got literally tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies going in one way, shape or form for renewables. So they've got this thing called the capacity investment scheme, which basically encourages the overbuilding of, wind and solar projects and guarantees, a price. UK's got exactly the same system. I think you guys call it contract for difference.
Yes.
But basically, if you get approval to build one of these projects, you then get a guaranteed price for selling your electricity in the market. The problem with it is, you build this grid. I'm using solar as an example. We have way too much solar power in the middle of the day, especially in summer. So the price is zero or negative, right? But the government's policies want to build more projects to deliver more power when you don't need it, right? So it's just completely nonsensical. Why would you do that? Like you need to match energy supply with demand. So why would you try and supply it
just on that,
in the middle of the day?
Just on that, they've actually now announced this sort of 3 hour.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just think about that. Because there's so much being created, they're saying, well, that doesn't cost anything. But the cost of the network is still there. So all it's doing is spreading the cost of the network over the rest of the hours rather than the 3 hours. So
all it means is price is going to go up at the other times, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So the fact of the matter is, if the price signal is saying don't supply more stuff in the middle of the day, well, why is the government pouring more subsidies into supplying more stuff in the middle of the day? And that can be for rooftop solar. So basically, the government's subsidising people to put rooftop solar up like you wouldn't believe, and then also grid solar. So we've got too much energy in the middle of the day. A lot of it's been wasted, so they call it curtailment. And then so they're trying to say, we need people to use more of that. But or alternatively, it doesn't matter, we just need batteries. But then, so the problem with it is with the energy market is you've got to perfectly match supply with demand. But we've got way too much that comes in the middle of the day when you don't need it, which then means you've got to move energy through space and time to when you can use it, which means you then got to spend oodles of money on transmission to move it around from far-flung regions and whatever, which costs billions and billions and billions, like untold billions. You then also need to spend uber amounts of money on batteries to then store the excess solar in the middle of the day so you can use it in the evening. But batteries are uber expensive. So a classic example came out this week or last week, Martin. I won't go on about this too much, but this is just hilarious. So we've got two examples of energy storage that are just ridiculously expensive and give you a taste of things to come. So first of all, the Snowy Hydro project, right? which is basically a 2 gigawatt water battery, right? So 2,000 megawatt water battery. Just think of it as a water battery. So that was announced by Malcolm Turnbull at $2 billion. The cost blew out to $12 billion. They've now done a 9-month delay because it's running years behind schedule to work out how much it's going to end up costing. A lot of experts think it's going to be about $20 billion. There's also $5 billion transmission lines being built. So you can just so you can move the energy from Snowy Hydro to where you need it. So that's $25 billion just for a 2 gigawatt water battery, right? It's insane. So that's enough to power, maybe 2,000 homes, right? For, I don't know, however many hours. We've got this other one called the Waratah Super Battery, right? So this is one of the world's biggest grid battery systems. So it was meant to be coming to play at the end of the year. That's 850 megawatts, which is enough to power about, I don't know, 960,000 homes, but only lasts 1 hour. So we're spending $1 billion to build out an 850 megawatt battery that lasts 1 hour. Well, what are we going to do when we shut down all our baseload like coal, etc., and we're running off intermittent renewables where most of the power comes in the middle of the day through solar, and then there's wind, which is just sporadic and turns up when it wants? What are we going to do when there's a wind drought? Or middle of winter when we have cloudy days and not much solar output? How many $1 billion Waratah super batteries that last 1 hour are you going to have to build across? Are we going to have to spend hundreds of billions of dollars building, 100 of these, 200 of these Waratah super batteries just so we can get through a wind drought? Like the numbers on this stuff is mind-boggling, and we're all going to pay for it. It's just insane. So anyway, I said to you before the show, we probably shouldn't talk too much about energy. So I think I'll just sound off there. But this is going to be very, very expensive, this whole, so-called renewable transition. And to make it worse, just one last point on the batteries, you're going to have to replace them every 10 to 15 years as well. So that $1 billion Waratah super battery, well, okay, 10 to 15 years, another billion, and then another billion, and another billion. Whereas you could build one bloody coal generator or a nuclear generator, lasts you 60 years. And you don't need all the battery backup because you run 24/7. So, the UK, as you know, you live there now, you are witnessing exactly the same stuff. I watch Catherine Porter in the UK, who's an awesome energy expert. I watch pretty much all her videos. And I tell you what, we have AEMO, you've got EMCO, I think it's called. It's all exactly the same. And I reckon Chris Bowen is a carbon copy of Ed Miliband, or as I call him, Ed Miliband. They are just two peas in a pod. We're doing exactly the same thing with exactly the same results. And whenever I watch Catherine Porter talk about this stuff, and anyone who wants to learn about this stuff, go and watch her videos. She's brilliant. You can just basically cross out the UK and put Australia in there. And there's a few different terms and, whatever, but we're doing the same sort of thing. And it's getting the same sort of results. Uber expensive energy, unreliable energy, and basically economic suicide. And that's what we're doing.
And one of the species' arguments is the so-called unit cost of energy generation, right?
Levelized unit cost. What a crock.
But that doesn't tell you anything. So it's
just the marginal price.
Correct. It's a deception. And when you actually think about, well, how do I actually make it all work? So that includes
total system cost is all that matters.
The power, the depreciation, the life cycle. Once you put all that back in,
the storage, the transmission, the subsidies, the contracts for difference in the UK, or the capacity investment scheme floor prices that are paid to all these guys. It's this levelized unit cost, I think they call it, or whatever. It's basically the marginal cost. Wind and solar are cheap because when they're working, it's free. It's like, but you need, so in order to run a grid on that, you need all this other stuff. You need hundreds of billions of dollars worth of transmission lines. You need hundreds of billions of dollars worth of battery and pumped hydro storage, so it's there when you need it. You've got to match supply with demand. And this is why there isn't a country on Earth that has basically gotten cheap power from ramping up wind and solar. It doesn't work. Like there's been, people have plotted the price of electricity on one axis globally versus on the other axis, the share of wind and solar. And it's like this, it goes up in a 45-degree line. So as the share of wind and solar go, globally, the cost of electricity goes up. And there's nothing in the bottom corner, which is basically high wind and solar share and low energy prices. It doesn't exist because it's not cheaper because of all these other costs that are involved. And nobody ever talks about these costs. And they're the costs that actually matter. And in your retail bill, when you buy electricity, when you pay your bills, the actual generation cost is like 35%, right? The wholesale cost is about 35%. The network costs and then the environmental costs, which are policy costs, so, renewable energy certificates and that sort of thing, makes up about, close to 50%. So that's the bigger share. And that's the bit that goes up heaps. And in fact, my last point, I won't harbour on too much, but in the UK, they did a parliamentary inquiry about 2 weeks ago, I think it was, or maybe it was a month ago. Time goes quick. And they had a whole bunch of energy experts come and give testimony. There was a whole bunch of them. I've got it captured on a video. And they all said that even if in the UK, the wholesale electricity price halves, right? So that's the marginal price. That's that 35% I was talking about. Even if that halves, UK electricity bills are still going to go up by 20% in the next 5 years because of the transmission costs, because of the renewable energy certificate type things, all those costs, all the other subsidies, etc., are going to increase the bills more than the reduction in marginal costs, even if that happens. And they also said that even if the wholesale price in the UK went to zero in the next 5 years, UK bills would be exactly the same as they are today because all the other costs are going to rise. Right. So every time you build a transmission line, like you spend, $5 billion on transmission line here, $5 billion there, it gets added in the regulatory asset base, and then then goes into network costs, which they then recover off you from your bills. So if all that stuff's growing really quickly because of renewables, even if the wholesale price falls a bit, your bills still go up. And there's no reason why the wholesale price would actually fall on average over time. Like you can get in certain, in spring in Australia, you get a lot of wind and it's not yet hot. So you're not using the heater. Sorry, you're not using air conditioning. It's not cold. So you're not using heaters. So it's like perfect time for renewables. Well, the wholesale cost fell this quarter. Great. But that's only one quarter. But over time, if you do a higher share of renewables and you knock out coal, well, you're basically going to have zero wholesale cost in the middle of the day and sometimes, but then at the other end, when batteries kick in, that's super expensive, or you've got to use gas, that's super expensive. Your average cost of wholesale actually goes up more than it would have been if you just ran on coal. So, the whole thing's a bit of a joke. And that testimony in the UK was just very interesting. Even if wholesale prices halve, UK energy bills are going to go up by 20% in the next 5 years because of all these other costs, transmission and, the network costs and the policy costs associated with all the other stuff that's involved, the environmental costs, all these sorts of things.
And in the UK, about 12.5% of the total cost of the average bill is actually not directly related to the power and energy system. It's all to do with insulation of homes and other public policy settings that were actually done some years ago to try and actually make housing more efficient. So that's one. And the other interesting, and they've just announced it, that because so many people now owe so much to their energy providers because they can't afford to, they've got this historical bill problem, those historical bills are now going to be effectively wiped and paid for from everybody else. So again, policy failure on policy failure, and policy intervention on policy intervention means that you're not actually looking at the pure note of what it's actually costing for your energy. There's so many other things tipped on top, and so many other policy decisions that have been taken over year after year after year, that it's like a bunch of wool, and trying to pull it all out and understand how it all works is quite complicated. So then the government just turns around and says, well, prices will be cheaper in 5 years' time, as though somehow magically that's going to solve the problem. There is a huge, huge black hole here, and a huge amount of misdirection and misinformation in this whole system. It's true in UK, true in Australia. The bottom line is that energy is way too expensive, and it's going to get more expensive, whatever you do, because the policy settings are just wrong.
Yep. And there's no reason why Australia should have that. because, unlike the UK, we actually do have massive energy resources here.
Yeah.
Right. We're just sitting on it. We're a country that is so energy rich, except for oil, but we've got pretty much everything else that the world needs. So we should have, we've got a massive energy endowment, but then we've got expensive energy. It's just crazy when you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Now let's move on to the other big thorny issue, and this is the one that I also want to come on today: migration. Right now, the ABS publishes the permanent movements data and the long term and the short term, whatever. And of course, they are very, very firm. It is not the same as migration. You can't use these statistics. And they sort of, I know they sent a few notes out to a few people when people were quoting these numbers. But the migration story is horrendous because it looks to me as though migration's on the way up again.
Yeah, that's right. So, look, the net permanent long-term arrivals data. So I've got a chart left. The one on the left's done by Tarek Brooker. It's really good. Basically showed that over the first 9 months of this year, we had record net permanent long-term arrivals. So it's not exactly the same as net overseas migration. So what it is, that it's basically the monthly leading indicator series that the ABS does, and it measures border movements. So when you come in, you do a passenger card, and you say, "Oh, I'm intending to come as a traveller, like a tourist." You tick that box, or I'm intending to stay long term, or I'm a resident returning. Those sorts of things. And they basically put in that bucket. So if you're short term, they just, you go in the short term series. And if you're intending to stay long term, or you're permanent, it's permanent and long term. And all they do is they net it out. So if you're someone who signs that card, you go out, you leave, they match it off with your passport, I guess. And then you come back and you do another one. They try and take the net series. And historically it's matched net overseas migration fairly closely, and that's the chart on the right by Alex Joyner. So it doesn't match it in a number sense, but it matches it in a directional sense. So when the net permanent long-term arrivals, jumps, usually net overseas migration jumps, etc. So, based on that, it suggests that immigration's rising again after, falling back a bit last year. And and it's also been sort of reflected in the rental market a bit, because the rental vacancy rate the rental market's retightened this year, right? So according to Cotality, the rental vacancy rate has fallen to an all-time low again. So it looked like it was loosening last year. So the national rental vacancy rate a year ago, this time last year, or October last year, was 1.9%, and now it's 1.5%. So it tightened up when immigration looked like when it started to fall. The rental vacancy rate picked up a little bit, and that reflects not just immigration, but also, more households moving into shared housing, that sort of thing. It takes the pressure off the rental market a bit. But now, according to Cotality, this year, the rental market, the vacancy rate's fallen again. The number of rental listings has crashed. It's actually down about 17% across the capital cities on a year ago. So the number of homes listed for rent has crashed. The rental vacancy rate's gone to a record low, and asking rents, so that's the advertised rents, I should say, are now picked up again. So they're now starting to rise. I'm just trying to find a chart on that I've got here somewhere. Oh, here we go. I've got a chart here. So that's the bottom right. So that's from Cotality. So the top right shows the rental vacancy rate. It's fallen the aggregate level to a record low again. And the bottom right shows the advertised rents in orange. So after advertised rents rose by about 40+% over the last 5 years, added about $10,500 to the typical tenant's annual rental cost over 5 years. So, the typical renter now is paying roughly $10,500 more to rent a home than they were 5 years ago, which is just insane. Rents are now picking up again. Now, that to me tells you or suggests that migration is tightening. Again, you've got record net permanent long-term arrivals, up 6% on last year. Usually correlates with net overseas migration. Net overseas migration differs from border movements because it's basically measured on they're called the 12-18 rule. So basically, to classify as being a net overseas migrant, you have to have been in the country for 12 out of 18 months. So it's slightly different definition, but they tend to follow each other. So, and here's the thing. So the federal government's actually made a whole bunch of rules to actually increase immigration. So a couple of months ago, they released something called Ministerial Direction 115, which pertains to the international student market. So what it did, it's done three things that aims to actually boost immigration. And this hasn't been discussed much in the media, but it really should be. We should shine a light on it. So, for starters, the federal government has raised the planning level for international students by 25,000 for 2026. So they've said that universities you can bring in 25,000 more international students than you did last year. But here's the rub: that's only a soft cap. So under the Ministerial Direction 115. Institutions are actually allowed to bring in 15% more than their cap. So what they've done is they've done 295,000 is the planning level, and they've distributed that across all the institutions, saying you can have this. Your indicative cap's this, whatever. What they've said is that you can actually go 15% above that, and the Department of Home Affairs will do nothing. And it's only when you go above 15% above your cap that we'll start to slow down visa processing. Right? So if you're a small institution and your indicative cap is 10,000, you can actually bring in 11,500 international students before the government will start slowing down application processing. So it's not really a 295,000 cap. It's a 295,000 cap plus 15%. Now, here's the other thing they've done. They've done two more things to boost students and therefore migration. They've also lowered the risk weightings on a whole bunch of South Asian nations. So if you're from India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, places like that, they've now lowered the risk weighting for those countries, for students from those countries. What that means is that they now don't need to show as much evidence, financial evidence that they can support themselves, English language standard proficiency. They don't need to show as much evidence or documentation to get a student visa. It's just easier for them now. To make matters worse, I think 13 universities, at least a dozen, have also had their risk weightings lowered under Ministerial Direction 115. So what that means is that these universities now can self-declare and they get less scrutiny and they can basically bring in international students a lot easier because their risk weighting's been lowered. So there's just less scrutiny now. So those three things, they've increased the cap. It's a soft cap. You can actually go 15% above the cap before you don't even get penalised. So if you go above it, you don't get penalised. There's no fines or anything. It just means that once you go 15% above, they'll start slowing down approvals. So if your cap's 10,000, then you try and bring in 15,000, well then the last couple thousand, you'll go to the back of the queue sort of thing. But you can bring in 15% more. So they've significantly raised the speed limit basically on that. They've also lower the risk weighting amongst Indians, etc. And India is now our biggest source in a given year for international students. So China still is our biggest overall source of students. But when you look at it on a flow basis, India is now the biggest. And for temporary migrants, they've basically made it easier for Indian students to come with less scrutiny, which just make it easy to get a student visa and study in Australia. And then they've also, as I said, a dozen or so universities have had their risk weightings lowered, so they get less oversight as well, and it makes it easier for them to recruit. So this whole Ministerial Direction 115 is geared around increasing student flows into Australia, which just means more migration. Now, it also comes at the same time as Canada is cracking down on international students, and so is the UK. So Canada, as I said, is doing a population freeze. They're trying to basically, dramatically cut the number of student visas that are issued. And where do you think, and most of them are from India, where do you think they're going to go? They're going to go to Australia, and we've made it easier to recruit those people. The UK is also cutting back. Well, UK and Canada competes with Australia for international students. Well, if those two countries are making it harder for international students and we're making it easier, where do you think those students are going to go? They're going to go to Australia, which means more immigration. Now, so because of this, the former Deputy Secretary of the Department of Immigration, Abul Rizvi, he forecast a couple of weeks back that Australia's new normal for net overseas migration is actually 300,000 annually. So that's actually about 15% more than what Treasury is forecasting. Now, the significance of that is, just to put that into perspective, Australia's net overseas migration averaged 90,000 per year in the 60 years following World War II. In the 15 years leading up to the pandemic, it averaged about 225,000. So it went from 90 to 225,000. That 225,000 was big Australia immigration, the Kevin Rudd era, etc. In the last five and 1/4 years, so since December 2019 to the March quarter of this year, which is the latest net overseas migration data we've got, net overseas migrations averaged 270. So it went from 90 to 225 for 15 years. The last 5 and a bit years, it's been 270. Now, Abel Rizvi reckons the new normal is 300,000. So immigration is just getting ramped up and up and up. Now, why that matters is because the national, according to AMP Chief Economist Shane Oliver, Australia's cumulative housing shortage as of the start of the year was about between 200 and 300,000, according to Shane Oliver. That was the cumulative housing shortage. And that housing shortage basically began in the mid-2000s when Australia massively ramped up immigration. Again, up to that 225,000. Now, the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, their latest state of the housing supply report came out, I think, in May. They forecast that over the next 5 years, under Treasury's immigration forecast, which is significantly lower than Abel Rizvi's, that Australia's housing shortage would worsen by 79,000 over the 5 years to the 2029 financial year. Right. So that's the 5 years of Albo's housing accord. However, in their sensitivity analysis, and that's the chart on the bottom left, the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, they said that if the population grows 15% faster than Treasury's forecast, which is exactly what Abel Rizvi suggests with his 300,000 NOM figure, then Australia's housing shortage is going to worsen by 200,000 in the 5 years to June 2029. So that to me tells you that if the housing shortage was already between 200 and 300,000, according to Shane Oliver, by the end of 2029, if we keep this high immigration going and if it's 300,000 a year, as Abel Rizvi suggests it will be, that our housing shortage is going to go to between 400 and 500,000 by 2029 because immigration demand, population growth, is going to far exceed housing supply. And what do you think that's going to do to the rental market? Right, we've already got a rental market where rental vacancy rates are already at a record low. We've had a 43% rise in rents in the last 5 years, according to Cotality. It's added nearly $10,500 to the annual rental cost for the typical Australian over 5 years. Well, if we're going to have a housing shortage that's going to get worse by another 200,000 over the next 5 years, last year and the next 4 years from here, what do you think that's going to do to the rental market? It means the rental vacancy rate's going to probably fall further. And the only reason why it wouldn't fall is if we have more people moving into group housing to compensate, right? But is that really, an improvement in living standards if Australians now have to share housing with people because they can't afford to rent? And it's the only way to avoid paying higher rents is to split it with randos. That's what we're going to have to do. Or kids are going to have to stay with their parents for a lot longer. So we're going to have children living with their parents in their 30s because they can't afford to go out on their own because it's too expensive. So, having a housing shortage, we've already got a very acute rental crisis here. The federal government has opened the international student floodgates, right? It's not just international students. We've got the volume of temporary migrants in Australia is at a record high. It's about close to 2.6 million people. That's not including visitors. So it's about 9% of the population now is on a temporary visa. It keeps going up and up. We've got graduate visas now are booming because the more you increase student visas and then you allow them automatically to have 2 years plus post-study as a graduate, well, then those numbers are going up. We've also got ballooning bridging visas. So bridging visas are handed to people who are awaiting decisions on their immigration claims. So one of the problems Australia's got at the moment, we've got all these fake students here And when the government tries, when their visas expire and the government wants to send them home, they then appeal. They try and claim asylum or something else. So then they go on a bridging visa for, a couple of years while they wait to have their claims heard out. Well, the number of bridging visas is now at a record high as well. So they're refusing to return home. Well, all this means is that immigration is just going to stay red hot. And, again, 90,000, 6 years post-World War II, 225,000, 20 years before the pandemic. The last 5 and a bit years, 270,000. Now Rizzo reckons 300,000 is the new normal. It's unbelievable. And this just means that, worsening housing crisis, worsening infrastructure crisis. Forget about net zero. Like, the government seems to have this fantasy that Australia can magically go to net zero by 2050. Well, how are you going to do it if the population grows by 50% by then? Like, if you've got 50% more people, roughly, consuming stuff, buying stuff, using energy, etc., we're obviously going to have more emissions. That's just, more people means more emissions. But the government has this fantasy that we're going to suddenly magically go to net zero. At the same time, it's going to keep growing the population like by Canberra every year. It's just, none of this makes sense. And it's not good for productivity. The charts I showed before showed that as we've ramped up immigration, well, productivity's fallen because we don't have the infrastructure to keep up. We don't have the business investment to keep up with all the extra people. The majority of the immigration we get is actually low skilled. So individually, they're not actually boosting productivity either, on average. Of course, there's a lot of good ones as well, but, on average, I'm talking about here. So this is just a recipe for lower living standards. And I've said this before, Martin, I live in Melbourne, and Melbourne was 3.5 million people at the turn of the century. We're now about 5.5 million people. So we've grown by 2 million people in 25 years-ish. And by 2050 something, like, early 2050s, the Victorian government forecasts we're going to be 9 million people in Melbourne. So we're going to magically grow by 3.5 million people over the next sort of 25 to 30 years in Melbourne. Like, it doesn't make sense. Like, how is that going to make you better off? I mean, the roads around Melbourne are now potholed. We've got crime everywhere. The economy is absolutely sick. And it's a congested nightmare. The only thing that's actually good about Melbourne is, I guess the house prices haven't risen for 7 years because the government's, taxed the crap out of property investors, etc. But, from a quality of life perspective, this is pretty bleak. And it's very bleak if you're a renter because you're just facing competition every single year from hundreds of thousands of people that are imported in the country without enough housing to accommodate them, which just means you're just competing for more and more, your competition just keeps going up every single year. And as a result, we've got, massive rental stress. We've got rising homelessness, and we're going to have people living in more and more, youngsters, well, not youngsters, but, 25 to 30-year-olds staying at home with their parents because they can't afford to move out, and a lot more people living with randos. It's not a very good situation here. And the sad thing is that National Housing Supply and Affordability Council data that I told you about. So their base case, as I said, was 79,000 shortage over 5 years based on Treasury's immigration data, or 200,000 shortage if population grows 15% faster. But here's the rub, and it's shown in the bottom left. If the population was merely reduced, well, not reduced, but grew 15% slower than what Treasury forecasts, instead of having a shortage, we'd actually have a surplus of 40,000 homes over the next 5 years. So Shane Oliver's 200 to 300,000 shortage would reduce to 160 to 260,000 shortage, right? So it's not going to fully solve it, but it means the situation improves. And the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council's own modelling, which is shown on the bottom left, shows that the number one solution, if you want to solve Australia's housing shortage and rental crisis, is to cut immigration. Because if you slow the population growth, you allow housing supply to keep up. Or even better, like what's happening in New Zealand, whereby because the population growth's collapsed, the dwelling stock, so housing supply, is now growing much faster than population growth. And as a result, the housing situation is improving rapidly. So, if Australia cut immigration to sensible and sustainable, to a level that's below the nation's ability to build housing infrastructure, well, guess what? The housing shortage would ease and the rental crisis would ease. But instead, we're doing the opposite. We can't build enough homes because we've got structurally high, costs. So costs have gone up 40% since the pandemic before. Land costs have gone up. We've got a shortage of labour. There just isn't the capacity to build more homes, but then we keep funneling in more people. It's a recipe for disaster.
And two interesting observations. The first is Matt Cummins, of course, from CBA, came out today and said that migration needed to be lower, right? And we might talk about that. The definition of migrants from New Zealand has changed a little bit. I think they're not in the numbers now, so that's another obfuscating factor. And of course, there's quite a lot of evidence that people are leaving New Zealand to come to Australia. New Zealand migration is significantly down. And the third factor I'd highlight is the number of multiple occupation homes. So this is actually a building that's been subdivided into multiple small pods, as it were, is going through the roof. Now, there's no official data that's actually captured on this particular one, I don't think, at the moment. Maybe the ABS will in the upcoming census, they should. But the other issue is the quality and, just the living space that people are in are getting shrunk more and more and more. So however you look at this is actually a mega disaster. And the point, to underscore what you just said, Leith, and it's really important people understand this, the migration question is not being anti, ethnic or anything like that. It's a fundamental economic problem. Supply and demand's too high. That means that effectively the housing situation is getting worse. So there is a critical issue here. And again, I come back to this shadow boxing. And yet people in authority, they don't want to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, and it's interesting you said that about Matt Cummins. So, Matt Cummins, the CEO of CBA, right? That's Australia's biggest bank. And even he came out and said, we've got a problem here. We can't build enough houses. And he suggested that net overseas migration should be cut to 185,000 a year. Now, the most recent reading was 316,000. That was the year to March. And based on this other data, it looks like it's probably picked up a bit, or, it's still at that level. So what he's basically suggested is that it needs to be 140,000 lower than what it is currently, or the latest reading, which, I'd argue that's still slightly too high. But, I certainly appreciate the interjection by him. Like, you'd think that the CEO of Australia's biggest lender, who actually profits from having more people lending, more customers, more, more Ponzi, even he has the honesty to come out and say enough's enough, and that basically infrastructure and housing can't keep up, and we need to cut it back so that they can keep up. I mean, it's just logic. This isn't rocket science. And it was also interesting you mentioned New Zealand. I'm glad you reminded me of that, because yes, there's a student side and all this sort of thing that I've just talked about, which they want to juice up again. But the Albanese government's actually stealthily increased the permanent migrant intake as well. So when they came to office, the permanent migrant intake was 160,000 plus about 13,000 humanitarian places, right? It's now officially, and I'll tell you why it's actually higher than this. They've increased it to 185,000, the permanent migrant intake, plus they've increased the humanitarian intake from 13,800 to 20,000. So the official permanent migrant intake is 205,000. 185, the permanent intake plus 20,000 humanitarians, which are permanent as well. Here's the thing. As you mentioned, they've made changes with New Zealand. So, excuse me, hay fever. So in, I think, 1st of July 2023, they changed the rules around New Zealanders applying for citizenship. So it used to be that, you can have unlimited Kiwis can come here and work, et cetera, right, as temporary migrants under the special category visa. What they did, but if they wanted to become an Australian citizen, they had to then become a permanent migrant first before they can get citizenship. And what they meant is that they fell into that cap, which was currently 185,000. And what the Albanese government did is they took them outside the cap And now they've given them a direct route to citizenship without having to become a permanent migrant first. So what that's meant is that those places that Kiwis used to take in the permanent migrant program now go into other countries. So effectively, and New Zealand migration to Australia averages about 30,000 a year. And what they've effectively done is increase the permanent migrant program to about 235,000 a year, right? By doing this trick with New Zealand, because all the New Zealand places are now being taken by other countries, but we're still getting the New Zealanders. So effectively, the permanent migrant program is now roughly 235,000. There's also some other stuff. They did some dodgy stuff with Pacific visas. So there's 3,000 there that we hand out every year, which aren't counted in the permanent migrant program. They're just given separately. But when you add it all up, the permanent migrant program is effectively 235,000 now. Whereas before the Albanese government came to office, it was 173,800 if you count the humanitarians. So they've massively increased that. And then now they've obviously massively increased the temporary migrants primarily through the student visa route. So they're basically pushing on a lot of levers here to ramp up immigration. And that is why I guess Abel Rizvi now, said 300,000 is the new norm. Well, that's what he suggested. So he said under current immigration settings, immigration will average around 300,000. Again, we've never had that sort of, there was only 1 year in Australia's history before the pandemic that we breached 300,000. And that was in 2008, 2009, where we hit 315,000 once. And it's in the chart, the top chart at the top chart on the right. I've done the green line with 300,000 net overseas migration. You can see before the pandemic, we only touched that one time. And that was under Big Australia, Kevin Rudd. In Australia's history, we only touched that once. Well, now Rizvi reckons that's the new normal. So, this whole migration thing ramped up. You can see in that chart, after 2005, we stepped it up to an average of 225,000 for 15 years. And then now it's been stepped up again. And this is the primary reason why we're suffering from a rental crisis. I mean, there's not really much else. If you bring in hundreds of thousands of people every year who need housing, well, you're going to cause problems if you can't build enough housing for those hundreds of thousands of people that you're building. And the worst thing about it is that, in the second half of last decade, so sort of between 2015 and 2020, there was a time there we actually did build enough housing for a brief period of time. And it's shown by Shane Oliver's chart on the top left in that thing. You can see the green line is his undersupply. You can see before the pandemic that the cumulative undersupply actually fell for a few years. And then obviously during the pandemic, when immigration turned negative, it really fell. And then now it's rebounded. But it fell for a few years because we had a massive high-rise apartment boom. So everyone might remember between 2015 and 2020, we had a huge surge in high-rise apartments. The problem with it is most of them were shoeboxes, and they were very poor quality. We had the flammable cladding, we had the structural defects, we had the Opal and Mascot towers. We had studies by the New South Wales Strata Association, etc., forecasting that something like half the apartment complexes that were built during that period had severe defects. Well, guess what? The only way we're going to keep up with such manic population growth is to build even more high-rise shoebox apartments, which are inevitably going to be very poor quality. Do we really want that future? Like, do we want to really bulldoze our suburbs into shoeboxes of really poor quality apartments like we had at the end of last decade? Because we're going to need an even bigger boom to accommodate this sort of population growth, right? If you think the high-rise apartment boom between 2015 and 2020 was big, it's going to have to be way bigger this time to accommodate that many people. And of course, whenever you try and ramp up construction so aggressively and so quickly, even if it were possible, which is not, because we don't have the resources to do it. We don't have the building resources, etc. But theoretically, if we could, obviously your quality is going to suffer, right? They're going to be worse quality buildings that are built. How's that an advancement? When really the solution, what we should be doing, is dramatically slowing immigration, right? Cutting it right back, making sure that most of the migrants that we do get are skilled, getting rid of stupid visa, visa categories like parental visas. We give away 8,000 parental visas every year to retirees from overseas, right? Parents of migrants that are here who come over here and they cost the taxpayer on average $300,000 a head in, health costs and infrastructure costs and everything else because they don't work. They just come over here to mooch. Well, get rid of that stuff, right? Save the budget a lot of money and, shift that to skilled visas. And, we should be running a significantly smaller migration program that is targeted on skills we actually need, very high skilled, very high paid. You can have your 50,000 family visas every year, but of that, we should be getting rid of the 8,000 parental visas and replacing them with partners. But the rest should be skilled, and it should be highly skilled, not this, pretend semi-skilled stuff that's not actually skilled and, all these other dregs that we get. Because our migration program is far too big and it's actually very unskilled when you break it down. And that's one of the reasons why we have a perpetual housing shortage and we have low productivity growth. And the worst thing about it is the number of migrants that we get actually work in areas like construction or tradies, etc., is minuscule. Right. So we add to demand for housing infrastructure without actually doing anything on the supply side. And as a result, it just makes the whole situation even worse. So the migration system is too big and it's untargeted to the skills that we actually need. So we need to fix it.
Absolutely. And it's worth highlighting, of course, that Treasurer will say, well, more people means more taxes, more tax take, right? But that's a very small, myopic way of thinking about it. And I believe that the economists within the Treasury are part of the problem. The private sector, of course, is full of the construction sector who want more people to sell stuff through. So they want to see high migration. And, therefore, a lot of people are pushing against this concept. But the truth is that if you want to solve the economic woes that Australia has, there are levers that could be pulled. The first one, migration lever. The second one is the energy lever, particularly on the gas reservations. And thirdly, if you then actually thought about, re-encouraging investment in the private sector in productive manufacturing, that would be quite useful too in terms of turning the ship around. But unless those policy changes are made, we're going to see more economic shadowboxing, aren't we?
100%. Unfortunately, that is, expect the phony war on productivity, the phony war on housing affordability, the phony war on energy, the phony war on immigration, the phony war on everything.
Yeah. We have a phony war. And Leith, I want to say thank you so much for sharing your thoughts this evening. If people want to know more about what you do, where do they go?
Yeah, so first and foremost, the mothership is macrobusiness.com.au. That's where I basically put all my writings, etc. Myself, there's David Llewellyn-Smith, and also Tarek Brooker chips in as well. So we've got a good team there. Alternatively, I put all my media interviews on my YouTube channel, which is just type my name, Leith van Onselen. You'll find it. It's just called Leith van Onselen or at Leith Vo. I'm at 22,000 subscribers now, I think it is. So, which is weird. But yeah, look, it's not as flash as this one. It's just basically I put up I should actually do some content, but I don't. I'm just so time poor. I don't have time to do it. But I just basically upload my media interviews. So if you want to see interviews on ABC, 2GB, Sky, whoever, I do everything basically. Go there and talk about housing, energy, all those sorts of things.
Absolutely. And in fact, this show will also get posted on Leith's channel too, because that's part of the nice arrangement that we have here. Leith, I want to say thank you so much for spending some time with us this evening. I hope to get you back once more before the end of the year so we can do a bit of end of year review and think about what's going to happen next year, because I think there's some interesting questions that we can explore there. But thank you, as always. I like these spicy discussions. You really put your finger on the pulse. And, hopefully we leave people with a sense of, wow, it can't be that bad. But also, very importantly, there are things that could be done if policy settings were different. So that's really the key point, right? So this isn't purely a negative conversation. It's trying to get people to understand that there are levers that could be pulled. And that's part of what we're trying to do here, because there are alternatives.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, look, we all live in hope, but unfortunately, unfortunately, our political class doesn't seem to want to do what needs to be done. So which is why. But if you don't know that, if people don't know this stuff, they don't know what's happening to them, then they're never going to question it. And we need more people questioning our leaders.
Absolutely. Well, step one is sharing the information and trying to get people to help and to understand. And that's why this is so important. Lee, thank you very much. Take care. I look forward to seeing you on the next show. And I'm going to take you offline now and I'm going to close the show.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, everyone.
So there you go. I hope you found that interesting, informative, hopefully a little bit cross-making as well, because these issues need to be discussed. And just to say that next week, Tony LeCantre will be on. We're going to spend some time talking about the markets and what's happened in the recent times. And Tony came back from a gold conference quite recently, so I'll get his debrief on that as well. And the doggies are still here. Yep, they've hardly moved at all the whole time, and we're relatively quiet today, so that's good. The bin man hasn't been yet, so that's quite good. So thank you very much for spending time with us this evening. Hope you found that interesting. Please like, subscribe, check out my recorded shows. I make shows every day, and the live shows come out on Tuesday. There will hopefully be an extra live show this Thursday with Robbie Barwick. Robbie went up to China, and Robbie and I are going to talk about what he found there, and hopefully that'll come out on Thursday this week, same time, but check the listing for that. It'll be posted if it's going to go ahead. So thank you very much. Take care. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics signing off. Take care.